Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are located right now. On behalf of the Research Institute for Peace and Security, or RIPS, I would like to extend our warm welcome to all of you participating in the RIPS International Webinar 2024. Thank you very much for gracing this event with your presence out of a very, very busy schedule. I'm more than pleased to see a large number of guests from various parts of the globe. Welcome. Let me say a few words at the outset. RIPS is Japan's oldest independent think tank dedicated to security studies. Last October, we celebrated its 45th anniversary. RIPS hosted this kind of international webinar in the several times in the past. And it is a great pleasure for us to do it this year as well. And today's topic is international order and territorial integrity in East Asia after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Almost 2 years have passed since Russia began to invade Ukraine. We can't foresee when it will end. The Russian invasion of Ukraine obviously has been swaying the entire rules-based international order. Russia even threatened to use nuclear weapons to deter NATO's direct involvement in the war if the international community acquiesced in the blatant violation of the established norm. Similar violence would easily happen elsewhere. Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida often says, Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow. And NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is right in saying what happens in Europe matters to the Indo-Pacific, and what happens in Asia matters to NATO. Russia should not be underestimated. Its decline, particularly in its economy and ground force, will be inevitable. But damage to the Russian Navy is slight so far, and the nuclear force remains intact. Russia will probably try to maximize the use of its naval and nuclear forces in order to exercise its influence. And if the tension is raised between Russia and the United States, the tension will be extended to the Sea of Okhotsk, just in the north of Japan, as Russia deploys its SSBN and SLBMs over there. However, as often said, the US-China rivalry will be the defining feature of international relations in this century. China is fully integrated in the international community. China is the economic hub of the region. As great powers compete with each other, others may benefit from the competition, but a partnership with authoritarian states is not risk-free. Reducing dependence on China and enhancing resilience is a serious challenge for all of us. East Asia is our focus today. It is exactly the forefront of the US-China rivalry, and this region is a seascape. The great poet of Portugal in the 16th century, Luis Vaz de Camões, said, "Where the land ends, the sea begins." East Asia is exactly the edge of a huge landmass and the starting point of the huge sea space. Land powers face sea powers in East Asia. And today, the connecting power of the sea is much more important than the stopping power of the sea. The sea is one, and the rule that governs the sea must be one. China's maritime expansion is being done at the expense of the established norm at sea. The war in Ukraine teaches us an important thing. No one country in today's world can secure its independence all by itself. International partnership is critical, particularly in maintaining the rules-based international order. RIPS would like to provide some food for thoughts for these international security issues with particular focus on East Asia. Yesterday, we discussed some emerging security frameworks in the Indo-Pacific region and also East Asian maritime security in the age of intensified US-China rivalry in the closed session. In today's public webinar, we would like to deepen our discussion with a wide range of audience. And very fortunately, we have four terrific speakers. As time is very much limited, I can't afford to introducing each of the speakers in detail. But just briefly, in speaking order, first, Dr. Eva Pezsova, Japan Chair of Center for Security and Diplomacy and Strategy of the Brussels School of Governance from Belgium. Welcome. And next, Dr. Shafia Muhibat, Deputy Executive Director for Research, Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS from Indonesia. And Rear Admiral Yamamoto Katsuya, Senior Research Fellow of Security Studies Program of Sasakawa Peace Foundation from Japan. And now, without further ado, let's hear the presentations first. And each speaker has exactly 10 minutes for initial remarks. So, Eva, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, President Tokuchi, and many thanks to RIPS for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I think as the European on this panel, I have been asked to focus more specifically on the war on Ukraine and, of course, its impact on the region. And this is a topic that has been quite popular over the last 2 years. So you've certainly heard many of the arguments already. But allow me to pick up on just 4 points for the sake of the discussion. And before I start, and you said it already, I think it's important to remind that 2 years, almost exactly 2 years after the Russian aggression, the end of this conflict is still very far from sight. And yes, we are all aware of the importance of defending Ukraine for all the principles that you just mentioned. And we've seen some progress, such as yesterday's council, the European Council decision to pledge another 50 billion euro in aid to Ukraine. But let's not forget that we are heading towards a period of political uncertainty with elections coming up in Europe, in the United States. So nothing, we're not there yet. And on the other hand, we know that Kremlin's is very much determined to keep its offensive as long as necessary. So here the balance is kind of tilting. But what does it mean? First and foremost, I think it shows us the crucial importance of deterrence. And it's actually twofold. So on the one hand, we realize how important it is to build a credible deterrence architecture in East Asia, which is really not there quite yet. Once a territory is acquired, it's very difficult to get it back. And luckily, this consensus has generated a certain dynamics that I will elaborate a little bit on later, that is currently shaping up this deterrence architecture in the region. Now, talking of deterrence, there is a reverse side as well, and you alluded to it, Tokuchi-san, already. It's that nuclear deterrence matters and it works. And that's a message that Russia has learned, and that's a message that China is learning, and other partners in this alliance as well, including North Korea, which is something that we need to keep in mind when discussing future possible contingencies in the region. My second point is that the war in Ukraine has somehow placed Europe a little bit more into the Indo-Pacific security debate. Against most fears and expectations, the war has not distracted, diluted, or anyhow diminished European interests in the Indo-Pacific, actually quite the opposite. And when it comes to maritime security, this has always been the case because Europe is a major trading partner, power, and has, of course, an interest in the freedom of navigation. What you said about Ukraine today, maybe Asia tomorrow, resonated loudly in Europe. It was thanks to the support also of Japan and Korea in Ukraine that Europeans have become more aware and more sympathetic to the developments in East Asia. And it's China's support of Russia in this conflict that has managed to plummet the image of Beijing in Europe in unbelievably low levels. So including in countries that have been traditionally but more sympathetic to China. So this consensus is really there. And you see some tangible evidence to this. Since we're talking about maritime realm, you have probably noticed the unprecedented level of naval presence of some of the European member states. Germany, Netherlands, France, of course, as a resident regional power, but also countries like Italy, that do not really have blue water navies, but still actually put the energy and effort and resources to deploy to the region to demonstrate the attachment of Europeans to freedom of navigation and to stability of regional seas. Now, I think it's important, no matter how we often tend to say that these are not really bringing much difference, I think it's important for several reasons. First, to test China's limits. Because if there are only Americans in the region, put it bluntly, we don't know if China's reaction is actually really against the legal principles or if it's against the Americans. So we don't see to what extent the US-China rivalry plays is a lens in their reaction. And second, it's important to internationalize these disputes. We talked about it a little bit yesterday, and I think Chris Johnstone made the point, and I agree. It's important to signal that these are not just bilateral issues, that we're talking about a common good, and therefore it is a matter of international concern. My third point, and it's related to the above, is that this interconnectedness between the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific security theaters is becoming much more apparent, and in a way gives birth to an emerging cross-regional security architecture. So we are witnessing this remodeling. Concrete examples, of course, it can be the EU's engagement with its East Asian partners and growing emphasis on security defense cooperation, but also NATO's cooperation with the IP4 or AP4, etc. New formations such as AUKUS or even the Camp David Agreement are examples of how this crisis has managed to kind of bring the key partners together around this idea of building a more credible deterrence architecture. And this will help the region to become a little bit more resilient, build the capacities, improve information sharing mechanisms, improve intelligence sharing in the long run. And my fourth point is that the war has put to light the sort of deepening divide between the liberal democratic countries and the revisionist powers. Of course, the Russia-China rapprochement is the example, and of course now the North Korea or even Iranian rapprochement is what we see as the top of the iceberg. But it is beyond. And I think it's something we discussed yesterday as well. We should not forget and diminish the importance of a very large number of countries that abstained in some of the votings, and that shows that there is, whether we like it or not, a degree of sympathy with the anti-Western narrative that China and Russia try to put forward in the countries of the so-called global South, the lack of a better word, many of which are in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, Indian Ocean region, and Africa, of course. Which brings me to my conclusion. And it was one of the questions that has been given to us. So where does it put cooperation with formations such as ASEAN-centered, ASEAN Regional Forum, ADMM+, etc.? I think it's actually of paramount importance to engage with those multilateral fora. Narratives such as FOIP or the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy or the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific put it right. They are all about the inclusiveness. They're all about actually even other issues than just the military strategic issues. It is the importance of trying to increase the economic integration of the region, to focus also on non-traditional security issues, the issues that matters for these countries. So I think we need to absolutely actually put forward our cooperation and engagement with these countries if we want to avoid greater polarization along the lines of the US-China rivalry and avoid more problems in the future. I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for your great presentation, Eva. Before moving on to the next speaker, I'd like to ask you one question. Please, make your comment later, of course. My question is about related to your third point and the final point. As you said, the interconnectedness between the Euro-Atlantic theater and Indo-Pacific Pacific theater, that's a very important point. And the new strategic dynamic between the two regions needs more attention. And how the two regions, I mean, Europe and Asia, can cooperate with each other in security terms. And that's a very big challenge for all of us. And I think, and as far as the Japan-Europe relations are concerned, there are two important political documents. One is Strategic Partnership Agreement, SPA, of 2018, and in which there are so many articles, and particularly Article 29 refers to the cooperation on maritime issues, not necessarily maritime security, but it says maritime issues. And also the other important document is Individually Tailored Partnership Program, ITPP, which was signed last year in Europe when Prime Minister Kishida visited Europe. And it identified 16 goals and 4 priority issues. And one of the long-standing security issues is exactly maritime security. So if possible, could you tell us how we can utilize those two important political documents in order to enhance the maritime security cooperation in future? Okay. Well, thank you very much for waiting. Renato, welcome to our project again. So the floor is yours, Renato. Please, 10 minutes.
Good evening. Again, thank you very much for Rips for giving me a chance to again be part of this discourse that involves, of course, U.S. allies and U.S. security partners, of course, dealing with a very important security issue. As you're aware, Tokuchi-san, I just came from Japan yesterday, where, of course, I attended a conference, a closed-door conference in the National Institute for Defense Studies. And, of course, my topic is, of course, the dramatic changes that's happening in terms of Philippine foreign policy and defense policy. In a way, the Philippine government just came out with a national security policy last year, and it basically pointed.
Oh, it's frozen. Renato, are you connected?
Maritime head-on challenge, and we see this happening, of course. Hello. Yeah, my internet connection is stable. Can you hear me now?
Yes, but you are choppy. Oh, okay.
Okay, I'm back.
Yeah,
Okay.
you are back. You are back. Okay.
Okay, where was I? I'm talking about, of course, the dramatic changes that are happening in terms of Philippine defense and foreign policy, to the point, of course, that the document, the national security policy document, mentions about the rules-based international order, and also use terms that, of course, are they're basically code of countries that directly challenge China. The fact that Philippine government documents now include the term Indo-Pacific strategy, that our national policy, grand strategy, foreign policy, is linked with the countries in the Indo-Pacific region. Of course, this was totally unthinkable during the time of the Duterte administration, a couple of years ago. But people are asking the question, what led to this dramatic change? People are pointing at the current administration, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., for making this dramatic change. Actually, the change happened earlier. Interestingly, it happened during the time of the Duterte administration, latter part. And what basically led to this dramatic change was, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact on him, the Philippine government, and more significantly, the armed forces of the Philippines. So actually, the changes was already happening even before the Philippine election in 2022, before, of course, the ascendancy of the current president, President Bongbong Marcos Jr., of course, is the most hated person right now in Beijing. After, of course, he greeted, just after the Taiwanese election, he was the only head of state that greeted Vice President Lai. After, of course, the successfully winning the Taiwanese election. China's reaction was so dramatic. So again, the focus is primarily on President Marcos. But again, my point, and this is based, of course, in a couple of two articles that I wrote, the change happened as early as the time of the Duterte administration. What led to this changes, early changes? Number one, of course, at the early part of his term in 2016, President Duterte adopted a policy of appeasing China. This appeasement policy is characterized by a number of measures. Number one, agreeing to China's means of managing the South China Sea dispute, bilateral negotiation. Number two, of course, efforts to distance the Philippines from the United States. And number three, that's something that was very crucial, of course, efforts to ignore the July 12, 2016 arbitral ruling on the South China Sea. So that has been the policy. But later on, of course, there was a realization that appeasing China simply does not work. Whether you appease China or not, China would basically affect its maritime expansion. So by around 2021, there was already efforts, a realization. When, I don't know if you remember, in February 2020, just before the pandemic, he abrogated the visiting force agreement. That was, of course, a blow to the Philippine-US alliance. But a couple of months later, he said, I'm basically, ending the abrogation process. After, of course, he met Secretary Lloyd Austin in Manila. Then a few months later, the Philippines, under the President Duterte, signed the joint vision for the alliance. So actually, the changes was already happening. Then, of course, something that really made him realize that, you cannot simply trust China, and the fact that sooner or later, China might destabilize the region was, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It was a shock for him. Initially, of course, the Philippine government reaction was that of neutrality, because the Department of National Defense just, I think, paid Russia a couple of hundreds of millions of dollars for a down payment for heavy lift helicopters. So the Philippine government was caught in a dilemma. Already paid the Russians to deliver the helicopter. Then suddenly, this thing happened, and the safe approach was, of course, declared neutrality. Eventually, of course, this has been undermined by the Department of Foreign Affairs and people in government who pushed for the Philippine government to take a more critical position vis-a-vis Russia, and that is, of course, supporting a couple of UN resolutions that, of course, condemn Russia's action, invasion of Ukraine, and also in terms of supporting the move of the Human Rights Commission to expel Russia from that commission. The Philippines voted positively, and slowly you see efforts changing. And then, of course, you have the internal debate in government about the implication of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Of course, the invasion happened in February. By May, and of course, I was doing consultancy in the government within the Armed Forces of the Philippines, within the Department of Defense. There was, of course, a recognition. What Russia did to Ukraine, this is something that China could do vis-a-vis Taiwan. So this is, of course, this is the direct impact, the psychological impact, and of course, also recognition that in the 21st century, war, conventional war could happen. It was a shock in Europe after 70 years. There was no major conventional conflict. Then it happened in Europe. It was also absorbed here, especially in the countries that, of course, are threatened by Chinese maritime expansion, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, so forth and so on. But more so, of course, important is the Philippines. So you have, of course, the internal debate happening. I was part in a number of closed-door meetings within the Armed Forces of the Philippines, wherein what will we do in case China effects the invasion of Taiwan? So, but at this point in time, this is openly, aside from the South China Sea issue, there's a realization in the Philippine defense establishment that Taiwan could be a more dangerous flashpoint, and this realization only came into being after, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this is the direct impact. So slowly and then, if you note the changes in the Philippine government position, around mid 2022, surprisingly, President Duterte offered the United States, if you want to use more facilities, aside from the original 5 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement and Clark and Subic, we are more than willing to do so. We would open. Of course, eventually, Washington ignored this. Washington thought, what basically caused this change in this administration that was, of course, trying to distance the Philippines away from the United States. Then, of course, this was also studied very well by the Armed Forces of the Philippines. The Armed Forces of the Philippines look at this, the fact that, have a great power invading a middle-sized country which practically did not have any military capability. And what's, of course, happened, this could also happen to us. But interestingly, the attitude is not of fatalism. It's an attitude of, if the Ukrainians could lick the Russians despite the Russians' military superiority, then probably you could also do the same. There's, of course, a recognition, a realization that asymmetric conflict might be the rule of the game when, of course, you have China. So you have planning there. I was basically involved in the discussion. At least there was a recognition. Then, of course, you have a change in government. There was initially wait-and-see attitude on what will be the attitude of the Marcos administration. Initially, of course, the Marcos administration tried to implement a balanced policy. We would continue improving our economic relations with China, but at the same time, we learned something from the Duterte administration. We cannot simply drop the alliance with the United States and the security partnerships with Japan, Australia, and South Korea. So there was an attempt to what I would call, using Mao's term, walking on 2 legs. But of course, China would not tolerate such efforts. From the perspective of China, Duterte has basically delivered the Philippines into the bag of the Chinese. Now you have this administration that's trying to, not really distance, but to balance. So then, of course, China started to conduct gray zone operations against the Philippines, but more significantly, what happened during the Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, when China, of course, launched several military exercises around Taiwan, some of them not very far from, of course, the Luzon Strait. And the first major foreign policy crisis that the current administration experienced was, of course, again, with Taiwan. And again, what comes into mind every time they look at Taiwan, if Russia could do it against Ukraine, China could do it against Taiwan. So, of course, China's effort to basically react to the changes eventually led to the offer of the Philippine government, this was as early as September 2022, to add 4 more Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites to the United States, 3 of them located in Luzon, not very far, of course, from Luzon Strait. So along, of course, with the shift towards a more hardline position against China, enhancing Philippine alliance with the United States and security partnership with Japan, of course, you have the slow distant relation from Russia. Russia hardly figured out in the foreign policy pronouncement of the Philippine government. And of course, eventually it was announced that the Marcos administration is supporting, basically would continue the Duterte's administration's, decision to cancel the helicopter deals from Russia. And of course, sweetened by the United States offer that we would replace the money that you already paid the Russians. We will provide you 100 million in direct military assistance. So again, this led to a further distancing of the Philippines away from Russia, and of course, recognizing the fact that there is, of course, an alignment between China and Russia. So all of this are happening, of course, under the shadow of the Russia-Ukraine war, as the Philippines slowly realize that the quintessential challenge to its national security is, of course, China. And the only way that the Philippines could be in a position at least to challenge Chinese maritime expansion is to be part of, like-minded countries. And, support from Europe was very much forthcoming. The German foreign minister came here, support from the EU, France offer. Yeah. So in a way, again, the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian war is in a way positive from the perspective of those who are, looking at the Philippine foreign policy, because there we realize who our friends and enemy are. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you
for allowing me the chance.
Yeah, Renato, thank you very much for your powerful talk. And I understand that the Philippines now has been awakened by Russia and China. And my question to you is that, as follows, because now we can understand that the Philippines is now trying to enhance its alliance relationship with the United States, and also enhancing the security partnership with other like-minded countries, including Japan. And I think it's a great and good development, positive development from a Japanese perspective. And I'm just wondering if that position is consonant with the general policy orientation of ASEAN. How do you, does the Philippines manage its own relationship with other ASEAN countries? I'm very much curious to know, but yes. You can, comment on this point later. And later. The next speaker, Dr. Shafia Muhibat. Shafia, it's been a long time. Thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome to this webinar. And the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes. Please.
Thank you so much, Professor Tokuchi. Thank you to RIPS for the kind invitation for me to join this session. Lovely to see friends, although on the screen only. And I think both Eva and Renato has explained so much about the topic today. I think I'm going to add just 4 more points, to also allow myself to stay within the 10 minutes allocation. The first point is basically, re-emphasizing what has been said, that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has had significant impact on the global political and economic landscape, and this includes East Asia. East Asia being a region already driven by its own unresolved conflicts and territorial control disputes. And within this region, of course, as we discussed, China's economic and military power has been the primary driver of security change in East Asia. So, whatever there are the other factors, such as the war in Ukraine, I don't think we are expecting drastic change to this but there are, of course, some strategic consequences nonetheless, as has been discussed. Among these are, the degradation of global security norms, the disruption to the global energy supplies, and of course, the pressure, to be basically show yourself as you are either for or against Russia. And all of this have contributed to making East Asia security even more complex than it already was. There's also the concern that Russia's military activities in the Far East region have raised concerns about the impact of the conflict on the regional military posture. And I think this is something that we need to pay a close attention to in the near future. Other than that, of course, Russia's breach of core principles of the UN Charter, especially respect for national sovereignty and territorial integrity, has worrying implications for smaller countries, especially in Southeast Asia. You know, Renato talked a great deal about this using the Philippines experience. And also, you know, the breach of core principles of the UN Charter also has impacts to the future of the existing regional security architecture in East Asia, which is, I think, the topic of our session today. Of course, the region is home to some of the world's most dynamic economies and also a hotspot for geopolitical tension. So, and I think the roles played by various actors and mechanisms and also impacts from the war in Ukraine will be crucial in shaping the future of regional security architecture in East Asia. My second point, you know, having said all this, specifically on Southeast Asia, having said all this, most Southeast Asian governments still regard the war in Ukraine in general as a distant crisis, you know, one of which there is little incentive to take a clear stand. So maybe this is confusing to most countries in Europe, you know, why there is very little incentive for countries in Southeast Asia to actually make a clear or strong position with regards to the war in Ukraine. You know, Southeast Asia has been relatively cautious in its response to the invasion of Ukraine, and also represented by ASEAN. ASEAN countries have generally avoided taking sides over the invasion of Ukraine, which I think reflects a lot about the divisions in the region's relations with Russia. So each of the ASEAN member countries would have different types of relations with Russia. And this really shows in the way that ASEAN countries have avoided taking sides in this particular regard. And, you know, this shows, although there was a statement coming out of ASEAN 2 years ago in February 2022, their deep concern was expressed. But you know, there's very limited clarity in terms of the stance of each and every ASEAN member states on this regard. Neither China nor the threat of Russia, of course, will lead to an alliance like NATO in East Asia, at least looking from a Southeast Asian point of view. But as I said, the war in Ukraine throws a starker relief in the divergence among Southeast Asian states, including in their relations to the US and its allies, and how to respond to the challenges to the rules-based order from China and Russia. My third point is specifically on the regional security architecture in East Asia, because I think that's the topic of today's session. Southeast Asian countries, again, I'm looking at it from a Southeast Asian point of view. We recognize that there are multiple actors at the heart of the regional security architecture, and issues like Ukraine really accentuate this fact that there are multiple actors at the heart of the regional security architecture in East Asia, even though we always emphasize on this, you know, ASEAN framework, ASEAN-led mechanisms, but there are multiple actors here. These include, of course, the US alliance network and the various minilaterals that have been established in the recent years. At the same time, in the midst of this geopolitical competition, strategic distrust, Southeast Asian countries continue to seek to resist pressures to pick a side, preferring to have constructive relations with both the US and China. Although I have to emphasize that this is getting more and more complex to do. A strategy that might have worked so far, but it's not picking a side might be, you know, even more difficult and more complex going forward. You know, Southeast Asian countries generally will try to find ways to, you know, side with the US on some issues, but also side with China on others. So choice does not necessarily imply a binary decision in geopolitical terms. However, as I said, such strategic maneuvering will likely become increasingly challenging over time, and we might not, you know, be able to be passive in response to growing and subtle pressures from both the US and China. So thus, on the one hand, these other security frameworks, the minilaterals, as I mentioned, are seen as challenges by ASEAN, particularly as they are seen challenging to the ASEAN centrality, and that they increase tension due to the nature of exclusiveness or, us versus another. On the other hand, I argue that Southeast Asian states also acknowledge that ASEAN is limited and that these unilateral frameworks are a logical consequence of ASEAN's own lack of ability to remain relevant in the current state of regional and global challenges. There are efforts that has been made, although with very, various limitations. We talked about the Indo-Pacific. ASEAN has made an effort to be more relevant in the Indo-Pacific. The ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific is one way, by having a collective outlook and perhaps later on a collective response. Through this outlook, ASEAN wanted to assert that it has its own strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific, which should be respected, I think. It is nonetheless has been on the receiving end of criticisms, particularly regarding how it is lacking clear strategy and follow-up for implementation. And I think issues like war in Ukraine has actually accentuated the inability of ASEAN to actually make clear influence or clear role in the ongoing challenges that exist in the region. Moreover, considering the growing number of Indo-Pacific strategy in the region and the growing geopolitical competition, a valid question that is now often asked is that is ASEAN sufficient to play a leading role in the region? A blunt and realistic answer, I think, would be simply no. But I think having said that, ASEAN centrality in regional architecture is necessary to establish rules-based order and prevent extra-regional powers from shaping the region. My last point is specifically on Indonesia. I think Indonesia has always sought to balance its interests while navigating the challenges in the region, including the great power competition. Indonesia has had complex relations with both the US and China, and also has had complex relations with Russia as well. So, all of these countries have in the past been partners. They have been threats as well. But I think for Indonesia, it has long been a priority to ensure that Southeast Asia remains free from the negative impacts of, great power rivalry. Specifically on Ukraine, if we recall, in 2022, when Indonesia was president of the G20, President Joko Widodo made an effort to visit both Kiev and Moscow. But I think at the back of his mind at the time was, the presidency of the G20, how to make it successful and to prevent direct negative impact of the war to Indonesia's economy. He was concerned about energy supply. He was concerned about food security. And I think those are the kinds of issues that make the conflict in Ukraine directly relevant to countries like Indonesia. So the conflict itself is still seen as something distant, but we acknowledge the negative implication that it would have to our own country and region. And I think this is something that is still something that exists, including for the general public. I don't think that either Indonesia nor ASEAN will make drastic changes in terms of their policy going forward with regards to the Ukraine. But of course, for Indonesia, we are eager to see an end to the conflict. Again, in large part due to its negative economic impacts. The economic consequence is felt, but not necessarily the strategic one. And I think this is something that needs to be underlined, that for a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, yes, the economic consequence is felt, but not necessarily the strategic one, including impacts on regional and the regional order. To be blunt, for Indonesia, there is no urgency nor interest to take sides. It will continue to prioritize strategic independence. There are other concerns that are prioritized in the region, especially with regards to China and the US. But I think in the long run, of course, we acknowledge the negative implications of the war in Ukraine. But then again, to make drastic policy changes, especially this year, as Indonesia's, we will have an election in 12 days. There will be a new government coming up because the current president cannot run again. And it'll be interesting to see if there are changes in terms of foreign policy and security policies coming from the new government. But I think fundamentally, things will remain the same. I'll stop
Yeah.
here. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Professor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shafia. And also thank you very much for referring to both ASEAN's view and Indonesian view. Thank you very much. Actually, in terms of your point about the multilaterals, I have a question for you because it's about the relationship between the ASEAN and the Quad. The Quad always emphasized its relationship with ASEAN and always respect the ASEAN centrality in its political statements. And recently, the Quad launched its own Indo-Pacific partnership for maritime domain awareness, and that initiative is very important for Southeast Asia because very often Southeast Asians say that they are blind at sea. So um, in order to engage in HADR activities and also in order to counter dark fishing in that area, I think that the partnership between the Quad and ASEAN about maritime domain awareness that's very important. So I'm just curious to know your view about the partnership between the Quad and the ASEAN. And anyway, thank you very much. And the next Japanese representative, Rear Admiral, Yamamoto-san. Thank you very much for waiting. The floor is yours. You have 10 minutes. Go ahead. Admiral, can you hear me? The floor is yours. Your turn. Are you muted? I can't hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Okay,
So,
okay.
thank you. I try again. I would like to keep at 10 minutes. The Taiwan presidential and diet elections have been successfully concluded last month. The election proved again to the international community that Taiwan society is one of the most mature democracy in Asia. And the fact that the ruling party and the first party in the diet differed in their result with over 70% of the vote is a true testament to the democracy. What is clear from this election is that Taiwanese society does not want independence, but it also does not want unification with continental China. Three major parties, including the KMT, want to maintain the status quo, and few in Taiwan agree with China's instance on unification. We must again understand that Taiwan is an entity with a different with than China. Moreover, Taiwan's will is embodied by a leadership elected through the mature democratic processes. So today, I would like to argue as follows. Taiwan, a matured democracy society, Taiwan is one of the key actors in our Senkaku Island issue. Taiwan's claim on the Senkaku Islands will not change, even the change of the ruling party. Current President Tsai Ing-wen also mentioned that sovereignty over the Diaoyutai, this Senkaku Islands, belong to Taiwan. The reason why there is currently no major issue between Japan and Taiwan regarding the Senkaku Island is that China exists as a common security threat to both Japan and Taiwan. This means that both Japan and Taiwan are making effort to that keep this issue from becoming a serious reality. But in 2012, former President Ma In-jew revealed that until the 1990s, Taiwan had an operational plan to land on the Senkaku Islands. And in 2008, when a Japanese Coast Guard ship collided with the Taiwanese fishing boat, the Prime Minister of the Republic of China stated that Taiwan would not hesitate to declare war on Japan. Japan and Taiwan are only 110 kilometers, uh, less than 60 nautical miles apart. They are bordering the neighbors. Any accidental conflict between the Japan and Taiwan military armed forces and the Coast Guard will only play into the hands on a third party, which is China. So next, the impact of the war in the Ukraine on the international community. Russian invasion of Ukraine was a great shock and lesson to us, the citizens, peoples of the Indo-Pacific. However, what I would like to emphasize here are the difference between Ukraine and Taiwan in Asia. First, the differences between the Russian Europe and the Indo-Pacific is that the main arena in the Indo-Pacific is the ocean, sea, and the members of this area are connected via water, which is a global common. Everyone knows this. Second, the difference in the status in the international community between Ukraine and Taiwan. This is because Ukraine is an independent country that is a member of the United Nations, while Taiwan is not. Therefore, in the European region security architecture, both Russia and Ukraine are treated as the equal actors. The international community openly discussed Ukraine's membership in a NATO and the EU, despite Russian opposition. On the other hand, however, many countries are security and a security architecture acknowledge, but not agreed. China's claim that Taiwan is a part of China do not have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Currently, Taiwan is not a member of Quad and AUKUS and ARF or ADM+, of which China is member. Taiwan's military is also not any part of the global and regional security frameworks, and therefore has no official relationship with Taiwanese military and the Coast Guard. China stubbornly excludes the involvement of regional security mechanisms on the grounds that the Sino-Taiwanese problem is a domestic issue. As a result, communication between Japan and Taiwan, the defense forces, and the Coast Guard, who are the forefront of the both sides' national interest borders, is hampered despite the fact that they share a border. And moreover, despite Taiwan's claim to the Senkaku Islands, which are the Japanese territory as its own. So our international community respects China's claims on the premise that China will resolve the China-Taiwan issue peacefully. However, if China breaks that premise, we need not respect it either. And why should we not have contact with the Taiwanese government or her military? China has military, on the other hand, China has military contact with the Myanmar rebels operating in the Sino-Burma border area for the defense of its own borders. This is despite the fact the government of Myanmar is a close friend of China. Of course, Taiwan's military is not a rebel army. It is the defense force of a democratic society with established civilian control. At least 10 United Nations member states recognize Taiwan as an independent country and have a diplomatic relation with Taiwan. In the Indo-Pacific, the Taiwan Strait is undoubtedly of the areas of greatest concern. Nevertheless, in the difference to China, the international community has maintained a state stance of not recognizing the Taiwan as a direct actor. That should not be a priori. This may be another impact of the cognitive warfare by China. As China attempts to change the status quo, we in the international community need to take a fresh look at Taiwan. In particular, Japan, which borders Taiwan with Taiwan, needs to consider the Taiwan as an actor in the international community. Finally, a lot of the world's submarine building companies operated in Taiwan new submarine building. Despite the Chinese pressure, heavy pressure, private sector bases mutual multilateral cooperation in the security field may be an implication as an option for a security architecture in the next future. For our community, which expect to maintain the status quo, Taiwan is maybe a reliable power. So thank you so much. I stopped it.
Admiral Yamamoto, thank you very much for keeping time, and thank you very much for referring to the importance of Taiwan. And since April 2021, we have seen so many diplomatic documents which refer to the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. So the Taiwan Strait is a focal point when we think about the security environment of this region. So thank you very much. And my question for you is could you tell us somewhat about the implication of possible Taiwan contingencies on the situation in the East China Sea and South China Sea, because Taiwan is exactly just between East China Sea and South China Sea. And today we are very lucky to have two guests from the United States and also from Japan, Mr. Chris Johnston of CSIS Washington, and also Dr. Saya Kiba of Kobe City University for Foreign Studies. So if both of you have comments to the four great presentations, I would like to hear your comments. Chris and Kiba-san. Chris, just 1 minute, please. Just 1 minute.
Good morning, Tokuchi-san, and good morning to all colleagues. Thank you very much. I thought those were really terrific presentations. Maybe I'll just really offer just a question and that perhaps you can take on in the general Q&A that follows. And it really sort of builds on what Ava asked me yesterday, which is, how do you think about, for all of you, how do you think about the role of European countries in East Asian security? And in particular, is there a role for NATO, or is the security role of European countries best pursued bilaterally, or through some other grouping that perhaps a new grouping that we ought to think about? Be very interested in how you think about the role of others outside the region in promoting security in East Asia. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And how about Kiba-san?
Thank you very much. Yeah, okay. Nice to see you all again. And then, yeah, okay. The follow-up question to the Professor Tokuchi is about the Quad and ASEAN, or some other mechanism of minilateral or multilateral. How to combine those kind of minilateral, multilateral cooperation between, particularly with the Western democracies, so-called Western democracies in ASEAN countries.
Right. Thank you. Oh, by the way, I have an announcement to the audience today. Please use Q&A box for in order to show your questions. So far, there are no questions, but I hope that all of you in the audience side have many questions to terrific speakers. So please do not hesitate to add any questions. While we are waiting for any questions and comments from the audience, I'd like to invite the four speakers to make comments to my comments or Chris' comments or Kiba-san's comment. Who goes first? Okay, Iva-san.
I'll stick to the original order, so I had more time to prepare.
Thank you. 2 minutes, please. 2 minutes.
Oh, okay. Because I was hoping to address your questions, and Chris' question was kind of all focusing on the same time. But on EU, Japan, or NATO Japan maritime security cooperation was your question. And I think it's important to remind that in this context, EU is the very different animal than NATO, than its EU member states or NATO member states, right? So there's 3 levels. But let me start with EU. And I think it's important to remind that the understanding of maritime security in the EU's context is much, much broader than the sort of traditional security, right? It's closer to what we consider being ocean governance. So we do talk about port calls and exercises and whatever, but that's very limited. That's a very small part of what the EU does, and it's usually executed by the member states. The big chunk, and I think that's actually the interesting chunk, is all the others. Maritime domain awareness, you just mentioned it. I mean, the EU has been trying to promote maritime domain awareness across the Indian Ocean region since 2015. There is a big project that has been going on that we tried to reach to Southeast Asia. It's still ongoing, and we've been trying to work with Japan to actually implement some of the MDA mechanisms in Southeast Asia. I'm happy to talk for an hour just about this project, but I won't be boring you. On UNCLOS, capacity building in understanding international law, this is something that the EU has been very involved with Southeast Asian countries as well. IUU fishing, border control, law enforcement, blue economy, shipping safety and safety of maritime infrastructure. I mean, these are all the things that really don't make the headlines, but are quite important and that the EU does pretty well because there's a unique expertise. On the level of naval, if we talk really more strategic, kind of security issues, there has been more going on with the individual member states. And again, while it's separate, it actually feeds into the EU dimension as well. And so you've seen a lot of bilateral exercises. Every time there's a European ship, of course, it will exercise with Japan and other partners. It does help to build interoperability, understanding, etc., between the two, which can, of course, be used in whatever situations there is. Piracy in the Gulf of Aden since 2008. We're all cooperating happily in the Arabian Sea is one example. And NATO, and I'll finish there, is yet another level. So, of course, it's not about NATO going to Asia physically. I mean, this is all completely ruled out. We all know that. But for Japan specifically, we know that Japan has posted a liaison officer at the NATO Maritime Command already years ago. We are expecting a new Japanese ambassador in Brussels. These connections are important for Japan and others to ensure direct communication, to know what's going on. It brings me back to interoperability, but it's also about maintaining the technological edge when we talk about new capacities at sea, in the subsea domain, in the surveillance, etc. And here we're going into the more kind of military and tactical dimensions. But I think at times where, and this is not just about China, we talk about China, Russia, at time these two are expanding cooperation in the subsea domain, in the Arctic, in space. All these have an inherently maritime dimension. And for all these activities, all eyes and ears are needed. And that's why I should emphasize the importance of information sharing, intelligence sharing, and deepening this type of cooperation at the kind of cross theater level.
Yeah, thank you very much. The Europe and Asia are also connected through the Arctic. So, I much appreciate you are mentioning the importance of Arctic region, but time is very much limited, so I don't want to go into the detail about that. But so, Renato, please.
Well, I'm going back again to the general policy of the Philippine government vis-a-vis, of course, Chinese maritime expansion. First one, of course, involves a credible arms buildup. But of course, in implementing these efforts to develop a credible arms buildup, primarily in terms of developing the Navy and the Air Force, there's of course a clear-headed recognition that no amount of military buildup would enable the Philippines to develop parity, of course, with China. So then you have the second pillar, which is very important, the reliance on our treaty ally with the United States and security partners. So in a way, if you could look at the Philippine pronouncement compared, let's say, to other ASEAN member states, like, for example, Indonesia, Malaysia, we're a bit similar to Singaporean position. We have been very much welcoming to Quad and, of course, with AUKUS. Of course, also in terms of the fact that we're getting assistance, diplomatic and military support from the EU, the head of the European delegation visited the Philippines last year. Then, of course, individually, you have the visit by the German foreign minister. Germany promised to provide drones for enhancing the Philippine Coast Guard maritime domain awareness. We're basically open. At this point in time, we are open to support from European countries, in terms of soft assistance. There's been offer, of course, France is offering to sell the Philippines submarines. It's also big business for many European companies, Sweden, so forth and so on. So in a way, we look at it as part of the effort to poise a credible balance against China by relying, of course, on alliances and security partnerships. But on the other hand, this is a question you raise. There's, of course, cost concern in the ASEAN countries, especially, of course, from Indonesia. I attended a maritime maritime security conference in Singapore, where many of my Indonesian colleagues and friends basically raised their concern. There's a fear in Indonesia that by getting closer to our alliance with the United States, the security partnership, we are slowly moving away from ASEAN. I guess this is really far from the truth, because historically, if you look at Philippine foreign policy since the 60s, when ASEAN was, of course, formed, the Philippines, of course, had military bases in the country, which accounts for the fact that the Philippines was lukewarm to the neutralist proposals of Malaysia and Indonesia that, of course, eventually led to the declaration of the Zone of Peace, Freedom of Neutrality, which is a watered-down version for any efforts for neutralism. So what we have been basically doing is consistent with Philippine foreign policy. In a way, we try to balance our relation with ASEAN and, of course, with our security relationship with like-minded countries. So there is no way that we would simply drop ASEAN like a hot potato. Our approach, of course, is to find the balance wherein we could rely on ASEAN when, of course, some issues are necessary, like, for example, managing the dispute in the South China Sea. But when it comes to hard security, that's where, of course, we would have to lean on our security alliance with the United States and, of course, other security partners, like-minded countries.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much. Dr. Muhibat, please.
Sure. I think I'll focus on the issue of Quad and ASEAN.
I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but there are already 3 or 4 questions from the audience. One is about the U.S. presidential election, and other 2 questions about the the next questions are directly addressed to Renato. 2 questions about South China Sea issue, and the 4th question. This is from Admiral Pradeep Chauhan. It's about India's role. I think that all the panelists can read these 4 questions. So later, please answer these questions if possible. But okay, Dr. Muhibat, please.
Sure. As I said, I think I'll focus on first, just 2 minutes to talk about, Quad and ASEAN and, possibilities of partnership or if there are any in the future. I think it's still very hard if you want to talk about partnership with ASEAN, as an institution, because as I mentioned, ASEAN is currently, 10 member countries, will soon hopefully be 11 member countries with very different linkages to either the US and China. So having a common view on issues like Quad, I think is going to be quite complex. You would find easier answers if you look at it country by country and how they view and their perspectives on Quad. For example, and it has been quite interesting because there are changes in this perspective as well. For Indonesia, for example, when AUKUS was first introduced in 2021, and I think also with Quad as well, there were, I think, concerns about, escalating competition and the risk of a war. Indonesia still adamant to not wanting to pick a side. And then there are also concerns about ASEAN being sidelined. And these are, things that were expressed, especially in 2021 when AUKUS was first introduced. But I think there are some, already 2 years after that, I think just as recent as mid last year, I think there were comments from President Joko Widodo saying that, we should view Quad, as partners and not competitors. I think that's the word that he used, meaning that there's already a bit of a change in the perspective with regards to this alliance and partnerships with Quad and AUKUS. But then again, that's perspective for one country, but trying to frame this partnership as a whole with ASEAN, I think that's a lot more complex than that. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker, Admiral Yamamoto, if you have any comments, please.
Thank you, Tokuchi-san. I have my answer to your question. Very simplest. Our community, we must not make a Taiwan an air pocket. Not only maintain the status quo in South China Sea and East China Sea, but also defense of Japan. We should not make a Taiwan an air pocket because particularly in South China Sea, Taiwan armed forces and Coast Guard capability is one of the biggest power in South China Sea countries, I believe. And so that we have to count Taiwanese military power as our capability. So because our capability is our group's capability, not only economic power but also the military power, I think. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. As I said before, we have already several questions from the audience, and one more question was added. It's about the ASEAN centrality. So in total, there are 5 questions. First one, U.S. presidential election in November. And the second, third question about South China Sea addressed to Renato. And the third question is about India's role. And the fourth question is, the final question is about the ASEAN centrality, I think. So, could anyone address any of these important and interesting questions, including Chris and Kiba-san?
Again, I'll just try to give my 10 cents view regarding the U.S. election. Again, it's coming out that once you have, let's say, Trump becoming, winning the election, there'll be a dramatic change. Basically ignores the fact that in certain issues, you have a bipartisan consensus, especially when it comes with dealing with China. In fact, the only thing that basically unites the Republicans and the Democrats is the issue of China. There might be certain problems in Europe, especially given the fact that the Republicans are very critical about the U.S. involvement in war in Ukraine and, of course, in NATO. But this is my bet. But when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region, I don't see much instability, whether you have President Joe Biden or President Donald Trump. Of course, the other factor there is like what happened during the first Trump administration was the fact that whatever Trump tried to do, he was of course balanced by the what he called the deep State Department, Defense, and even of course his vice president then, and even at a certain point the Senate. So again, we have these concerns, but at the end of the day, I still have my bet on the notion of bipartisanship in the American political system, and of course the role played by the National Security Council, the State Department, and Defense. Every president will have other concern, whoever will be on the top. A lot of domestic issues would be the primary focus of whoever would be in the White House after this year's election. Foreign policy again will be managed by the the traditional foreign policy defense community. Now, when it comes to the question here, what we expect from the what's the meaning of IP countries? Can anyone tell me what they mean by
Indo-Pacific countries?
Oh, Indo-Pacific countries. Well, it depends, of course. When it comes to what we call the core, or what we call the hubs and spoke system, which of course the Philippines is part of. We of course depend on the United States in terms of the security guarantee, support, diplomatic and defense assistance from Australia, Japan, South Korea. We're sourcing our military equipment primarily from South Korea and in a certain degree Japan. So that's where we rely on the hard security. Interestingly, of course, India has become a source of one very important weapon system that we got. That's of course the BrahMos missiles that will be part of the anti-access area denial capabilities that the Armed Forces of the Philippines has been developing. So that's where, of course, we rely on the Indo-Pacific countries. That's also in terms of training, so forth and so on. So there's a question here about ASEAN countries. If the ASEAN countries remain together, but of course, I don't think this will happen. In terms of what I would call the structure, there's always a gap, a cleavage between the continental Southeast Asian countries and the maritime Southeast Asian countries. We have a different take on a number of issues. Philippines is hardly concerned with what's happening in Myanmar. We cannot expect Cambodia and Laos to take a very active role in the South China Sea dispute. So this is a reality we face. ASEAN is far from being a very cohesive regional organization. This is in a way ASEAN's weakness, but also its strength. ASEAN has survived primarily because of the fact it provides certain leeway for its member states to adopt certain policies that will, not in a way contradict the core element of ASEAN. That is, of course, a non-intervention in domestic affairs and the annual consultations. So again, that's the point. That's why, of course, in the part of the Philippines, we have to rely on the hubs and spoke system, the Quad and AUKUS, when it comes to hard security, because this is something that ASEAN can hardly provide, given, of course, the very nature of ASEAN as a regional association. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Admiral Yamamoto, please.
Thank you, Tokuchi-san. I would like to comment about the South China Sea issues. So, unfortunately, in the South China Sea, the China deployed to the maritime militia, deployed to the Chinese fishermen as the maritime militia to enhance to occupy the they called the blue territory. So unfortunately, to counter the Chinese activities, some Southeast Asia countries using the same approach with to the counter China. For example, the Vietnam, they have Vietnam maritime militia to deploy to the South China Sea to counter the Chinese militia. I claim to the my Chinese friends that using the Chinese maritime militia approach is the human shield at sea, I said. So of course, I understand not only Japan, but also the America, Australia, and the European countries efforts to the support to the capacity building to support. But we should strengthen our support to the Vietnam, not only Vietnam, but also the other South China Sea countries, or the maritime law enforcement capability, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Can anyone address the question about the naval and maritime role of India posed by Admiral Chauhan? Kiba-san, can you answer this question? India's role, because you visited India several times last year, right?
Well, actually, not only last year, but this year. But what I sense is that the diversity of the Indian-based think tanks, and they are very open to the any kind of minilaterals, multilaterals, etc. And the role of the veterans, including the admirals and including particularly the maritime admirals, that's very important. And then they are, the Indian-based think tanks are really keen to open. They are very open to the discussion with the European countries, and then any kind of like-minded countries. Yeah.
All right. Dr. Muhibat, can you answer the question about the ASEAN centrality, the final question?
Sure, I can try. I mean, the question itself, questioning ASEAN centrality with regards to lack of, military or capability to define the agenda. But I don't think, in this regard, ASEAN centrality is not about military power. I think it's about, we've always said, ASEAN has this convening power, and you don't really see anywhere else, whether it's in, annual meetings where, where the major leaders of the major powers and the most important powers in the region would have regular meetings to discuss various issues. So centrality itself is more about defining the agenda itself, not really about having the military capability to actually implement some of these agendas. But because whether we talked about U.S.-China relations, since the beginning of this discussion, and we talked about how it has serious influence and impacts on Southeast Asia. And I don't think that Southeast Asian states should be a spectator or sit at the back and look at the two major powers relations influence this region. But ASEAN centrality is about not being a spectator, and it's about this convening power to allow ourselves to take part in deciding the agenda, in setting the agenda, and making sure that our interest is paid attention to.
All right. Thank you very much. Already the time is 2 or 3 minutes past 11 o'clock Japan Standard Time. I think it's time to close this webinar. Of course, there are many more questions and much more room for discussion. But today, I hope that we provided some important food for thought about East Asian security, and also partnership with the United States, and also partnership with European countries. So I think we can, contribute to enhance regional security, particularly maritime security in this region, in cooperation with other, like-minded countries more proactively. So thank you. Thank you very much for your contribution to this webinar. And I have to apologize to all of you because of some connection problem. The starting time of this webinar was a little bit delayed. But anyway, thank you very much for joining us this evening or this afternoon or this morning. Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank all of you. So I would like to close this webinar today. Thank you very much for everyone. Bye-bye.
Matane.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Matane.
See you again soon. See you again soon.